allegory, that as Rome is religiously ordained, as Rome effectively is the creation of the progeny of Mars, thereby the sons of Mars, and also through the matrilineal line, the descendants of Aeneas. And in the same way that we also have accounts of the fact that Romulus was effectively spirited away at the end of his relatively long reign, and that he effectively was deified and became Quirinius. That all of these things, again, are to allude to a divine origin, whilst the actual historical event and the accounts of the man is something which is actually in bearing and in keeping, I would say, with what we can consider to be historical events. And something I'd also want to comment is on the rape of the Sabine women. But just before I get to that, what do both of you have to say about that?
Just very quickly, just since you have the map up, is that just to further emphasize the point you made about Rome being sort of this city of upstarts and brigands and of essentially Latium hillbillies, if I can use the reference, is that one thing to consider here is that you're correct in saying that much of Latium, and it's also true of Campania, the region, both the historical and present day region of Campania, make for very good farmland and a very productive soil types, and very suitable for agriculture and cattle and that sort of thing. Another point worth mentioning, and you do see it on this map, because I actually have never seen this before, funnily enough, this particular image, and that is not only was the Tiber prone to flooding, but essentially where Rome would sort of become this great city of the Republic and then the Empire was, in fact, a particularly marshy part of the country and a very marshy part of the Tiber. And one of the incentives for the Romans to have actually constructed the Cloaca Maxima was obviously it served the purpose as an actual drain for refuse and for sewage out of the main part of the city, certainly from the Palatine and Capitoline hills. It was also used to drain the marshes. The Romans built the original forum on what was the marshland in that separated these two hills. You can see there's a body of water that separates the Camalus and the Capitolinum, these two hills. That obviously gets eventually built over. And so the fact that this is a marshland would have made the original, the original settlement easy to defend, but also adds to that notion of sorry, my tongue's burned on me. The fact that it's rather inhospitable, particularly for anyone who might wish to attack Rome, made it a defensible location. So, just that's a point worth mentioning.
And indeed, the fact it's founded, with the Mars-esque origins and hardy origins, essentially.
Yeah.
To emphasize, and thank you very much for that, Mark.
I meant to say inhospitable. Oh no, I can't do it. No,
inhospitable.
Thank you. No, I was trying to do it as an active, like inhospitability. But anyway, sorry. Go on. Bye.
Yeah, just before we move on to the rape of the Sabines, a few things to say in general then about the Romulus and Remus, the Romulus story. I think, well, first of all, there's this idea. I err on the side a bit more towards Mommsen. I'm not prepared to say they're completely fictional, but I would suspect they're much more fictional than completely based in history. Just for example, the thing of going down the Tiber in a basket. I mean, it's very Moses, isn't it? It's very Sargon. That's a classic thing. That's a sort of a classic thing. The thing of being
it comes up a few times, doesn't it? In ancient history,
it's a motif, isn't it? Yeah,
and so is the fratricide. You just have to go all the way from Cain and Abel to Fafnir and Fasolt to get the same result. Exactly. So it's very possible. But again, it seems to be that what I'm essentially trying to get at is what is historically plausible and what is later heroic appellation, effectively. Right. To what extent is this backforming? There is an argument to be made that the name is backforming, but I think it is equally plausible that some random war leader could have given his name to a settlement as for it effectively having been originated from the Tiber itself, which is the conventional wisdom. That to me doesn't seem in any way implausible.
No.
So what we're talking about essentially is Romulus fulfilling these heroic cliches, which are found across many Indo-European civilizations, and that has been the appellation on them. And the way we can talk about divine origins. When we look at earlier histories, earlier historians weren't atheists, and they also weren't privy to the notion, essentially, of historical objectivity, i.e. trying to draw a line between whatever their individual beliefs were in terms of the survey effectively they were doing of their historical periods. In the case of Livy, we're talking about a narrative history of Rome where we arrive at the city which has conquered the world, in the same way that it is the predestination of Aeneas which is so important to the writings of Virgil. That predestination is exhibited many times in the works of Livy. It is divinely ordained. It is fortuna. The whole notion of the divine of fortune is ever present in the foundation of the city of Rome. Yet there is a kernel, I believe, enough in the historicity of Romulus himself, where you can actually draw a lot more. And indeed, in terms of the whole meta-understanding of how the Romans saw themselves through a figure like Romulus is also incredibly important to me, less so than simply dismissing it all as a fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. No, interesting. I would say, well, as a general point, that's sort of the meta point of how the Romans wanted to think of themselves, Romans during the early to mid Republic, I suppose, how they liked to think of themselves. And in that sense, when you look at it like that, through that lens, I suppose, it is very interesting because the story is both absolutely glorious and badass and very nasty and ignominious and not far from glorious. It's both those things, isn't it? Because, to be descended from possibly Mars, badass, right? To be suckled by a wolf, badass. They're like wolf men, right? But also, and at the same time, to be the result of a rape, even a divine one, pretty ignominious. To be suckled by a wolf, an animal, feral, pretty nasty, right? Not glorious. So it's two things at once. And that's why it's particularly interesting, because if something was going to be made up from whole cloth to be as glorious as possible, you wouldn't necessarily put in the details, the classic details that we get about Romulus and Remus. You wouldn't necessarily do that, I don't think, which does lend weight to the idea that there are kernels of truth in there, possibly. But yeah, I mean, it has been noted by a number of later scholars, 19th, 18th, 19th, 20th century historians, saying that it is a bit of an odd one in the most general sense, the Romulus and Remus story. And the fratricide thing, it's not a great look. It's two things at once, isn't it? It's kind of bad, as you're saying. I'm prepared to kill even my brother. That's how much of a psycho I am. Don't mess with me.
Well, let me emphasize this.
It's horrible and immoral at the same time, isn't it? It's two things at once.
Well, let me emphasize this. Do you both recognize this picture, which is the thumbnail?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. It is the Oath of the Horatii by David, a French painter of the 18th and 19th centuries. However, probably the most known aspect of the story of the Horatii is the actions of, I believe, Publius Horatius. Effectively, the Horatii were joined in their effort against one of Rome's enemies, and the Romans won the battle. The Horatii won the battle. And one of the member of the gens Horatii, one of the females, was married to the enemies of Rome, and she wept uncontrollably at the loss of her husband. And on the spot, Publius Horatius murdered her, and then was exonerated for the crime by the Romans. And he murdered her because he would not countenance a woman to weep over the death of Rome's enemies. And you can just again see that in the parallel of Romulus, effectively. Romulus and Remus. Remus committed a transgression against the foundation of Rome, and thereby he must die. We're talking about absolutely horrific origins, and yet there is, for some reason, again, an element of Romanitas, which is supposed to be imbued in these extreme actions undertaken by these semi-historical figures. And yes, and someone is mentioning the enemies at the time were the Curati.
In a slightly equally severe, although perhaps with slightly less reasoning. Although I suppose, in a sense, he did obey Roman law. But I just can't remember the names at the moment. The story escapes me. But there's I can't remember if he was just a consul or a Roman dictator. But the Romans were fighting one of their regional neighbors. I can't remember who exactly it was, whether it was the Samnites or the Etruscans. I can't remember exactly. But the Romans were ordered to, hold the fort. Meanwhile, the general's son ventured out to challenge a champion who fronted up to the walls of the camp and, set upon the enemy champion and defeated him. But because he had violated essentially the Roman notion of disciplina, of obedience of orders and to remain disciplined, his own father, the commander of the army, executed him, put him to death. It's another such sordid story, and in many cases, a lot of people would be horrified at that. But the Romans do have this, and particularly in this sort of, in their own sense of antiquity, in their very, very distant past, the Romans do have this kind of knack for these stories that are sort of, as Bo said, double-edged. On one part, hugely impressive; on another part, quite horrifying, particularly to modern sensibilities.
And just a reference, sorry, Bo.
Well, just very quickly, I think, just to add to it, I don't want to sort of overkill the lily, but the very nature, the very having a fratricide deeply, deeply woven into your sort of origin story, it is odd, because again, it does say that something like Rome is more important than family. That if even your own brother, your own father, your own son does something against Rome, you should kill him. So there's that element to it, which on some level is sort of extremely, extremely strong and as I've said before, badass. But also at the same time, even in the ancient world, it's one of the worst things you could do. One of the worst crimes you could ever do is to kill your father. Just short of that is to kill a brother. It's a terrible, terrible crime. Terrible crime.
The cause of the city above the loyalty to Gens, one might say, Bo.
Yeah. So exactly, yeah. So it is odd, and it has been noted before. And one last thing to say about Romulus is you mentioned AM reference that at least in Plutarch, his end, he's supposed to have basically just disappeared, isn't it?
I think it's far more likely that this was an obfuscation for the fact that he was almost certainly murdered. Which all the writers seem to hint at or allude to. It's almost as if you can imagine. No, but it's almost as if you can imagine the murder of Caesar in the Senate House, but he was deified, before the first blow. Effectively, that is essentially the story. They're alluding to, if we sort of understand. So even contained within the account, it seems that deification is almost an escape for us. Essentially, you can say a horrific end to what was a very dubious reign.
I think it's almost certainly the case that his political rivals assassinated him. Yeah, but the fact that it's passed down to us that he basically sort of disappeared and was probably just became a god sort of suddenly. It does remind us, doesn't it, that we're dealing with a story that is, again, to be kind, at least partly mythological. Like you have to say that. You can't say it's not that anyone is, but you can't say that it's firmly in the light of history. All right, so but I just find I find it fascinating that the Romans could have told a different story about themselves, but they didn't. This is the one they chose, really.
But again, it's not a matter of choice. Again, it's a matter of, especially in the case of Livy, we're talking about historians are trying to relay what they believe to be the traditions of the city. Again, that should be an emphasis, tradition to hand down in terms of its original Latin origin, tradere. That is so much of what, history was to the Romans, far more so than to someone like Herodotus or Thucydides or Polybius, who was even a Romanophile. And so it's only therefore, natural, essentially, that they are telling the tale of themselves, but they're also essentially saying that these are the examples which we live by, which are both wonderful and absolutely terrible. And I think because of that, because there is this earnest attempt again to represent tradition, not to invent things for the sake of invention. I think Livy, say for example, was in the court of in the court of Augustus, but he had no interest to be a partisan of Augustus. He was a Republican. So again, we're talking about what is essentially the historical consciousness of Rome at the time. And you mentioned this originating during the time of the high and late Republic periods. Well, this is coming into full force during the early Empire period as well. The idea that Augustus wanted things to appear as traditional as possible, while obscuring the fact that there has been a revolution also within the whole Roman political system under Augustus. It's very interesting, but I want to finally come to the rape of the Sabines, because this again is one of these stories about the reign of Romulus, which is considered so awful that some people have even tried to suggest that it was actually Greek propaganda made against the Romans during the reign of Pyrrhus Veperus. Which is the notion that all of these ne'er-do-wells within the city that effectively had formed the communia and the original curias or the councils or the assemblies of the Roman people went ahead one day and they abducted their wives effectively. And when you understand the whole sort of Roman notion of connubia and the sacrosanct nature of marriage, in addition to reference the fact that Romulus is supposed to be illegitimate, this seems all the more remarkable. But even the ancient sources are aware of the fact that Rome is an upstart city. And so what does the mass abduction, and we don't mean rape necessarily in the sexual sense, because it seems that very much that these women ultimately accepted their lot and they became wives rather than simply sex slaves, as that would indicate. Rapine began as basically the loss of will, effectively, in this sense, not just the sexual act. So the abduction is also used in terms of the reference of rape. But it's the idea that the Sabine women that they encountered, the Romans, were of a much greater stock. And so you're simultaneously establishing the Roman senatorial class. You're establishing the patres, the ancient gens of Roman civilization, and you're doing it essentially by thieving wives, as if this were, the Mongolian steppe, or, a horde people effectively, no greater than, their Celtic neighbors to the north or the Sabines to the south. So it's Rome is essentially taking this right, this justification essentially to ennoble itself by effectively dispossessing it of others around them. And again, as you can probably tell, that is an act of volition. That is, Rome is going to assert itself, and it's basically going to conquer the familial sort of prestige and gravitas of these families, which is essentially forcing them to marry. Yet at the same time, it's an abduction, it's thievery, it's banditry of the worst kind. So how can you look at the reign of Romulus and say that this is purely the result of some sort of mythological fiction? Because it seems that, based on everything that we know about the foundation of Rome, it seems that what the reign of Romulus really represents is a summation of, you can say, the true character, if not the exact events of the foundation of the city. And that's what I find fascinating about it.
Yes, I mean, no, absolutely. The rape of the Sabines. I mean, one thing I come back to whenever I read about or think about the rape of the Sabines is that it's far less. I think it's fair to say it's far less horrific to their mind than to ours.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating, Bo. You say that. I mean, I only knew about this for a large part of my life because I knew the painting by Rubens. Right. I didn't really know any of the context behind it. Right. But now, decades later, finally understanding the context, it's horrific that Rubens would decide to make that the subject of his painting, but nevertheless, there we are.
The idea in our world, to our sensibilities, the idea that you would abduct a bunch of nearby women and just take them as you said, as sex slaves, something like that. To our mind, it's like there's not many things more barbaric and egregious than doing something like that. And although it's still a crime in the ancient world, it's much more de rigueur. That's what happens. There are barbaric peoples beyond the horizon, and they may at any moment come into your world, kill all your men, and rape and enslave all the women and children. That's a reality, right? We don't live in that world. Or there's some places perhaps on the globe that still do.
Yeah.
However, we don't live in that world and haven't for a long time. But even to the Romans of the very late Republic, sort of Polybius times, or of the Augustan age, talking about Livy, for example, that they still lived in that world, right? And the fact that I find it very interesting, as AM you also pointed out, that in the story, ultimately, although there's a battle, isn't there? There's a long back and forth. Ultimately, the men folk all come to an agreement, and the women, or most of the Sabine women, accept it. Right. So again, it's very alien. The whole story is really quite alien to us.
And you know what's even more? Just before you say anything, Marcus, what's even more fascinating about this? The origin of the Roman Republic, mythologically, is in response to the rape and suicide of Lucrezia. So the Roman kingdom that was inaugurated with the mass abduction effectively received its, the Republic was, the casus belli for the creation of the Republic was something along a very similar line.
Yes, and the thing is also, it's a bit like in past streams and elsewhere, I've obviously grated at the modern day misusage and misinterpretation of the phrase dictator, because obviously we're talking about the time period where that's actually relevant. I think also, to a point, I think in the context of the situation with the Sabines, and in particular the painting that you're referencing, AM, is that the usage of the word rape probably is sort of either incorrect or ill-fitting for its intended purpose.
Well, we talk about rapinum, which is basically is essentially subjugation and the dispossession of will, less than the sexual act itself.
Granted. But what I'm saying is, obviously, the modern term is a very loaded term, and we have very deeply ingrained ideas of what that is. And it comes with its own sort of, dare I say, modern day definition. And so when people actually see that painting, or they see that title, that description, Rape of the Sabines, they have this sort of preconceived idea of what it is based in a modern context. Whereas, what we're really talking about is, you say, there's a deeper and a more sort of a slightly separate context in reference to this. And even though it is still an act of, you might say, it is still a callous act, it is still an act of one might even describe as barbarism. The other thing to take into account is, and it's funny you have this map up here, it's quite appropriate, is that the Etruscans aside, even though there were Latin people, particularly in the southern portions of Etruria, particularly in these cities that you see here, Caperna, Veii, etc., particularly those ones that sit along the Tiber River, that these other groups here, the Volsci, the Latini, the Aequi, the Sabini, the Marsi, the Hernici, etc. These are all sort of a fraternal Latin people. Once you go further south of here, and I presume you have other maps, AM, but once you go further south of here, you have more the Oscan, Sabellan-speaking peoples of southern central Italy. But these here are Latins, and not all Latins are Romans. They become Romanized in time, but they are not all Romans. But basically, the Romans are among the Latins, and all these Latin peoples are a kin people, which is why, in the case of the abduction or the absconding of the Sabine women by the Latini, by the Romans, they are a kin brotherly people, and so it's a case of they are not alien, and therefore they can be brought in, and it isn't a contradiction, nor is it a dilution of identity. These are basically it would be no difference than, say, someone, an Anglo-Saxon from Wessex marrying an Anglo-Saxon from Northumbria, for instance. They're a kin brotherly people who share an ethnos and a language and a culture, and so it wasn't a particularly alien concept insofar as melding these two peoples together. They're actually quite they're within the same umbrella group, as it were.
Well, yes. What essentially part of the overall sort of, I would say, chronology of this stream is the Roman, less the unification, but more the domination of the Italian peoples. Not Italy itself as we would come to know it, but the Italian peoples, the italics, as Marcus has alluded to, which are the denizens to central Italy, and effectively what we would know it. But what you've been describing is something which I was going to allude to, which is also the fact that invariably the legendary Romulus also had a co-king who was a Sabine. And we can see that again in the precedent with the whole notion of the consular rule later on. But what you're essentially describing is a Roman ethnogenesis in many ways. And I think that's the intended interpretation, effectively. It is the subjugation of the women, but they have essentially transcended that, and it's become, from what was essentially a horrific act essentially of enslaving women in some senses, to the Romans it has become their ethnogenesis under their founding semi-divine and later fully divine sacred king, Romulus. And that really comes to the remaining sort of legendary kings, off the top of my head, Numa, Tullius, and Ancus, because less can be said about Ancus and Tullius, partly because when we talk about Rome as a warlike confederation, that doesn't really come into fore until much later within its history. Rome itself was a rather confined political entity until well after the end of the Roman kingdom. But take, for example, a figure like Numa. Mommsen won't attest to the historicity of Numa, but Numa again is one of these important sort of identities to consider in terms of how the Romans again perceive themselves, which is that Numa is responsible